Welcome back. Last time, we saw what scribes and carvers did to cover up their hieroglyphic errors, and how one example of recarving led to support for the ancient astronaut theory. But we also learned the ancient hieroglyphic names for some important sites in Egypt. Let's go over the homework that included those names, starting with the 3 hieroglyph to English sentences. Our first one looked like this. You'll remember I gave you nonverbal sentences, sentences where some form of the verb to be is understood, so you had to supply that. Let's take it a word at a time. What's our first word? Yes, Osiris. Next? Yep, it's the owl, which means in or of or from. But here it's pretty clear. It's in, because of what follows. It's Wea, the sacred boat, which ends in the boat determinative. Beneath it, we have our suffix viper, so it must be his sacred boat. That's followed by another owl in. Now last, what's the place name? Yes, Abydos, which is appropriate. Abydos is the burial place of Osiris and his sacred city. Now, to complete the sentence, we add the verb is, and we have Osiris is in his sacred boat in Abydos. Good. Let's do the next sentence. Again, it's a nonverbal sentence, so we'll supply the is or are later. What's the first word? Yes, Amun. What's next? It's the Neb sign, and here it certainly means Lord. All or every doesn't make sense. Next, we have our owl, and here it will mean of, since what follows is Waset, Thebes. So if we have to supply the verb, we have Amun is Lord of Thebes. Let's do our last hieroglyph to English sentence. We recognize the name Hathor right up front. Now, she too is followed by a Neb sign, but beneath it is a feminine loaf T. So it's not Lord, it's mistress. Mistress of what? Well, we see the Iunu pillar and the town sign, but we have the feminine T. So it isn't Heliopolis, it's Dendera, where there's a fabulous temple dedicated to Hathor. Note that here we didn't have the owl for of, as in the of Dendera part. I just wanted to show you that it's often omitted. We have to be flexible when translating ancient Egyptian texts. This isn't German or French. You're doing well. Now let's translate the one sentence we had to do from English to hieroglyphs. Tutankhamun is Lord of the Red Land and Black Land. Again, I asked you to translate it as a non-verbal sentence. So we begin with Tutankhamun. I think because you understand how hieroglyphs work and what they mean, it's easier for you to remember how his name is written. Since he's a king, we know his name goes in a cartouche. But we also remember that because of honorific positioning, the god's name always comes first in writing. So we start with Amun. Then we have the Tut part, followed by Ankh. We also know that the word Tut means image, and the Ankh is life. So the name means the living image of Amun, or something like that. That makes it easier to remember. Okay, we have the Tutankhamun. Now we just need the Neb sign for Lord, and now we can put in the owl for the of, if we like, or leave it out. Let's leave it out. So next is Red Land. Again, the flamingo is a triliteral, D-sh-R, desher, which is the word for red. And last, we need Black Land, which is Kemet, the same as Egypt. And that's our sentence. Tutankhamun is Lord of the Red and Black Lands, written as a non-verbal sentence. Very good. I hope you're having as much fun with this as I am. Now, put on your scribe's robe, get your reed pen. It's time for our hieroglyph lesson. I'd like to show you a few more names of places in the ancient world mentioned in Egyptian texts. Then we'll use these names to discuss differences between inscriptions on temples and tombs. Then, at the end of the lecture, we'll translate some inscriptions in a tomb. Let's start with some foreign lands. One of the most famous monuments in all of Egypt is Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple called Deir el-Bahri. That's Arabic for place of the northern monastery, because in early Christian times, monks built a monastery there. In Hatshepsut's time, her temple was called Djeser Djeseru, holiest of holy places. Mortuary temples were where priests would make offerings to the Ka, or soul of the deceased pharaohs. You see, when you died, you didn't just go away. You still needed maintenance. Prayers had to be said, offerings had to be made, so you would continue in a happy existence in the next world. These transactions with the next world took place at the mortuary temples of the pharaohs. On the walls of these temples, the pharaohs carved texts and scenes describing the events of their reigns that they were most proud of. On Hatshepsut's temple, she boasts that she erected 2 tall granite obelisks in only 7 months. But she was even prouder of the trading expedition she sent to the land of Punt. On the temple walls, Punt is spelled like this. The phonetics are pretty clear. The reed mat P, the rabbit UN biliteral, the water sign N phonetic complement, and the loaf T, followed by the foreign land determinative. But just where Punt was is not so clear. We know that the trading vessels sailed south on the Red Sea. From the carvings on the temple wall, we know the inhabitants of Punt lived in thatched huts on stilts, and that they had frankincense and myrrh trees. Today, the best guess is that Punt is where either modern Eritrea or Somalia is, near Ethiopia. Hatshepsut's record of the Punt expedition is important. It is the earliest depiction we have of a sub-Saharan African culture. I view it as the first ethnographic study in history. Hatshepsut didn't go, but scenes on our temple wall show the queen of Punt greeting the expedition. The queen is obese, as is her daughter. Possibly they suffer from elephantiasis. But as I mentioned, Punt supplied Egypt with incense, probably shipped north on the Red Sea. I think this may be why Punt was also called the God's Land. Incense was what the gods loved to smell. But now, Egypt's ships are in Punt, and Hatshepsut has a plan. She's smart. On the temple walls, we see Egyptian sailors loading incense trees on board, their roots protected in baskets. Hatshepsut will grow her own incense back in Egypt. Indeed, on the walls of Deir el-Bahri, she proclaimed, "I made for my father Amun a Punt in Thebes," meaning that she had frankincense and myrrh trees growing there. Today, when you visit the temple, you can still see the roots of the trees brought back from the faraway land of Punt. In almost every mortuary temple, you'll find place names on the walls. It was a big deal to go to a foreign country. On the mortuary temple of Ramses the Great, we hear how he defeated the Hittites, ancient inhabitants of modern Turkey. The name of their land was written like this, and it was pronounced something like Khati. We often have a second source for how a foreign land's name was pronounced, usually the ancient language of that country, so that helps us recreate the pronunciation. Ramses also subdued the Nubians, the people to the south of Egypt in modern Sudan. Nubia is a relatively modern term from Roman times. In ancient Egypt, it was called Kush. The largest building ever constructed by one pharaoh is the mortuary temple of Ramses III, which was called the Mansion of Millions of Years. Like other kings, Ramses boasted of his military prowess, and he had a special reason to brag. During his reign, Egypt was invaded by a confederation of foreigners from several countries. Some came from the Palestine-Syria region, and their land was called something like Rechinu. Other members of this confederation came from Crete, and they were called the Cheftiu. The autobiographical texts on the mortuary temples contain so many battle scenes that when Napoleon's savants saw them, they couldn't imagine such brutal scenes being carved on temple walls, and so they assumed these structures were palaces. In the Description de l'Égypte, the mortuary temples are always called palaces. Now, for a non-battle-related foreign land. Do you remember where the chest containing the body of Osiris washed ashore? Byblos, modern Lebanon. This is how it looked in hieroglyphs. The hieroglyph that looks like a spitting fish is a K-A-P triliteral. The word was pronounced something like Kapni. Now, that's enough for foreign lands. Let me give you the name of a very important city, Memphis. We're already quite familiar with Thebes, or Waset, the religious capital of ancient Egypt. But in the north, for many centuries, Memphis was the administrative capital. We know Thebes better because it was in the dry south, where papyri, temples, and tombs are all better preserved. The water table was much higher where Memphis was located, so most of the monuments are gone, sunk into the mud. Memphis was written like this, and was pronounced Men Nefer, the beautiful monument. It even has a pyramid determinative. Most of the major cities in ancient Egypt had a triad of patron deities. At Memphis, it was Ptah, the creator god, his wife, Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess, and their son, Nefertum. At Thebes, it was Amun, Mut, and their son, Khonsu. Let me give you just one more place name, this time a temple, Karnak, and then we can talk about temples and tombs a bit. It was pronounced Ipitsuit, the most select of places. The throne hieroglyph also meant place. The name suggests that Karnak was the most important of all the temples in Thebes. Karnak is a good starting place for a discussion of temples. It is the biggest of them all. To be accurate, Karnak isn't a temple. It's a cluster of temples built over centuries, with successive pharaohs adding their temples to gain favor with the gods. This group of temples was situated on the east bank of the Nile in what the Greeks called Thebes and what the ancient Egyptians called Waset. The other large Theban temple complex was about 1.5 miles away and is today called Luxor Temple. Sometimes, temple was written Necher-Per. These temples were viewed as the god's house. This is a very important concept, one that made prayer in ancient Egypt very different from prayer today. You don't disturb a god in his house. You don't go there to pray. Many of the temples at Karnak were devoted to Amun, so many of the buildings were viewed as his house, and the ordinary people were not expected to go visit him. There was no day of prayer in ancient Egypt, nor a time during the day when the Egyptians were supposed to pray at home. When tourists visit Egyptian temples, sometimes they notice that there's no place for the people to sit. That's right. As a matter of fact, temples always had large enclosure walls around them to keep the people out. Prayer was the business of the priests, and it was better to leave it in the hands of the professionals. The temples on the east bank of the Nile have religious scenes carved on their walls. The pharaoh is shown making offerings of beer and wine or incense to the god. Priests are shown in procession, carrying the cult statue of the god. There are a few autobiographical texts on these walls. Those are on the Pharaoh's mortuary temples on the West Bank. This is where we get biographical material on Ramses the Great, Ramses III, Queen Hatshepsut. Both kinds of temples were for worship. After all, the Pharaoh was a god, especially after he died and joined the other gods. Although Pharaoh was a god, he wasn't on a par with the gods who were in the next world. That's why he had to make offerings to them, please them with gifts after a military victory. He wasn't in the same class as Amun, Ptah, or any of the others in the Egyptian pantheon. While temples are places of prayer, tombs are places of burial, and this obviously affected what texts were placed on the walls. In the tombs, we have prayers for the dead. To a great extent, the prayers and traditions of the funerary cult of ancient Egypt were established during the Old Kingdom and remained relatively unchanged for 3,000 years. Things did not change quickly in Egypt. From the Old Kingdom on, there was a standard prayer for the dead called the Hotep di Nesu. I think that just from the sound, you might be able to get an inkling of what it's saying. There are 3 words there: Hotep, Di, and Nesu. Which can you translate? I think Hotep is the easiest. To be pleased. What about Di? To give. The hardest one is the Nesu. Let me show you the hieroglyphs for the entire phrase, and then you'll probably figure it out. The Nesu is the first 2 hieroglyphs. The sedge plant was called the sut plant in ancient Egypt. It was feminine, and thus the loaf tea. Later, it became synonymous with the word for king, as in king of Upper and Lower Egypt. And thus we have a non-feminine word, king, with a T in it. The T is usually not pronounced. The word for king comes first because of honorific placement. The next hieroglyph is our Hotep sign, and usually it means to be pleased, but here it really means an offering, the thing that pleases the gods. The last hieroglyph is the D, to give. So the phrase meant something like, may the king make an offering. The idea was that you were a member of the court, and you hoped the king would make offerings to the gods on your behalf. Over the centuries, the prayer would vary a bit, but it always began, Hotep di Nesu, may the king give an offering, even if you weren't a member of the court and had never known the king. Let's look at the next section of the prayer. May the king give an offering to whom? Yes, Osiris. And that makes sense. He's the god of the dead, and you want him pleased, so he'll accept you into the next world. Note that often his name is written without the god determinative. Then come 2 hieroglyphs we have seen. The Necher flag, which means God, and that's followed by the Ah hieroglyph, which means great. So Osiris is being called the great god. The Neb hieroglyph, Lord, is then followed by a city we've seen in our homework, Abydos, the sacred city where Osiris was buried. So Osiris is also Lord of Abydos. Abydos was so sacred that every Egyptian wanted to make a pilgrimage there to make an offering to Osiris. Now, let's look at the next section of the prayer. Well, we start with a verb, to give. Then we have the suffix pronoun viper, so it's he gives. Actually, as you'll see in a minute, it's so he may give. Okay, what's he giving? Well, that nice little arrangement of 4 hieroglyphs around the house translates as vocal offerings of bread and beer. The house hieroglyph, I think, represents the tomb. The tall, thin hieroglyph within it is the or, that was part of the word for voice, cheru. So it's an abbreviation for voice. Something said in the tomb is a prayer. Also, the reason it's a voice offering is that you didn't actually have to physically offer the things. You could just say it, and it was so. Now, on the left side of the oar is bread, and on the right, a jug of beer. So it's a voice offering of bread and beer. It's like when we say meat and potatoes to mean food. This combination of 4 hieroglyphs is called a pertcheru, a voice offering. Now, let's see what other offerings are there. The next 2 are easy. They're ideograms, oxen and fowl. The loop of a chord is an SHS biliteral and means alabaster. So one of the offerings will be alabaster jars of oils. The other hieroglyph, what looks like 2 vertical poles, is supposed to be a strip of cloth with fringes, and it's a kind of shorthand for clothing. The full word was pronounced menchet and was written like this. So far, we have, may the king give an offering to Osiris, the great god, Lord of Abydos. May he give a voice offering of bread and beer, oxen and fowl, alabaster and clothing. Now for our next line of the prayer. The first word we know, chet, which means thing. That's followed by neb, which can mean all, every, or Lord. Since it's following thing, it probably means all or every. I bet you noticed the loaf T under the neb sign. I also bet you realized it's there because chet is feminine and the adjective all has to agree with it. Good. What's our next word? Yes, the nepher sign, meaning good or beautiful. Here I think good is the best choice. You'll see. The next word is one of my favorites. It's a monogram, a word made up of 2 hieroglyphs conjoined like Siamese twins. Monograms appear occasionally, and you can usually figure out the meaning. This one is a water jar on top of the foot B. The word was pronounced wab and means pure. There was an order of priests called the wab priests. If you wanted to write wab priest, you just put the man determinative at the end. A wab priest is a man who purifies. Since the deceased is now a god, everything he ate, the offerings, had to be purified. As part of the wab priest's duties, he would purify the altar on which the offerings were placed, the food, the dishes containing the food. Everything had to be pure. This was done by pouring water over everything while a prayer was recited. Okay, what's our next word? Yes, ankh, to live, or life. We'll decide which one later. Next, yes, netcher, the flag, meaning God. Okay, next, im. That's the word for therein. Let's see how to translate this section. We'll get a running start at it by going back to the beginning. May the king grant an offering to Osiris, the great god, Lord of Abydos. May he give a voice offering of bread and beer, cattle and fowl, alabaster and clothing, all things good and pure upon which the god lives therein. When we translate, we usually leave out the therein. We really don't need it in English. You're doing very well, but you're not done yet. There's one last section of the prayer. What do you think the first 3 hieroglyphs say? It's good to remember the context. It's a funerary prayer. Also remember what came just before. A list of offerings. So, of the first 3 hieroglyphs, I think the ka biliteral, the upraised arms, stands out clearest. It's the word for soul. So the phrase will be to the soul of. The next word is imachi, the venerated one, the deceased. And then we get his name. Ramses, with a God determinative indicating he's dead. This Ramses isn't the king. He's a commoner. That's followed by an epithet we have seen before. True of voice, meaning he's deceased, and the gods have declared him truthful, worthy of entering into the next world. Once again, let's read the entire prayer. It's good practice. May the king grant an offering to Osiris, the great god, Lord of Abydos. May he give a voice offering of bread and beer, cattle and fowl, alabaster and clothing, all things good and pure, upon which the god lives, to the Ka of the venerated one, Ramses, true of voice. This prayer was probably recited millions of times in front of tombs throughout Egypt. The actual burial was always below ground, but during the Old Kingdom, the superstructure built on top of the tomb, what we call a mastaba, was really more of a chapel than a tomb. The Hotep Dinasu was intended to be recited every day for eternity, so the funerary cult became big business. If you were wealthy, to ensure that offerings would be made after your death, you might set aside an acre of land and deed it to a special priest who said such prayers. These priests were called Ka priests. Remember our old word for priest was hemnetcher? The Fuller's Club hem means servant, and the flag is God, so a priest is the God's servant. The hieroglyphs for Ka priest are hem Ka. As you can see, it means the servant of the Ka. The plural was hemuka, servants of the Ka. The U ending marks the plural form. See the three strokes under the man determinative? That tells us it's plural. So these Ka priests would make the offerings at the tomb every day. And as long as they did, they could farm the land deeded to them. This could pass on down to the priest's descendants as long as the descendants said the prayers. So you would get families with many generations of Ka priests. Kind of like what we have today, with families who for generations have run funeral parlors. Because of a remarkable discovery made by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the early 1920s, we know quite a bit about the life of a Ka priest named Heka Nacht. The name is two words, Heka, meaning ruler, and Nacht, which is mighty. So our Ka priest name means the ruler is mighty. The Metropolitan's excavation team was working across the Nile from ancient Thebes in the area of Deir el-Bahari, where Hatshepsut built her famous mortuary temple. Centuries before Hatshepsut's time, the nobles of the Middle Kingdom were carving their tombs into the cliffs in the area. And this is where a wealthy Theban named Ippy had his tomb carved. He was a thoughtful planner and put aside more than 50 acres as an annuity for his Ka priest, so the Hotep Denisu would be recited daily. Ippy died before the tomb was completed, and he was interred in his unfinished tomb. As far as we know, his Ka priest recited the prayer and made the voice offering, but then he died. His son, Heka Nacht, who lived in a village in the north named Sidr Grove, then moved to Thebes to take over his father's duties as Ka priest. Heka Nacht was now responsible both for saying his prayers and overseeing their family estate in Sidr Grove. And he began writing a series of letters that he intended to send home, giving very specific instructions about how his property should be protected, what prices to get for crops, what wages to pay. Heka Nacht wrote these letters inside the tomb, where he seems to have set up his office out of the blistering Theban sun. As he wrote each letter on papyrus, he folded it into a small packet and sealed it, so no one but the intended recipient would read it. When he completed each letter, he placed it in a wooden box, intending to send the entire batch back to Cedar Grove. But he never did. We have these letters because of a remarkable sequence of events. Ippy's tomb was a large one, so his descendants sold some space in the tomb to a man named Messa. When Messa died, it seems he had a hasty burial while Hekenocht was away from the tomb. In the rush, Hekenocht's letters and some of his writing equipment were swept up in the rubble left over from preparing Messa's tomb. And there his undelivered letters lay for nearly 4,000 years, till the Metropolitan Museum of Art excavated the tomb and found them. Okay, car priests, it's homework time. Now that you're an expert on the funerary cult of ancient Egypt, let me give you a variation of the Hotep Dinessou to translate for your homework. I'll give you 2 tips for your translation. First, the hieroglyph of the head in profile translates to something similar to our face hieroglyph. Second, there are 2 names in the prayer. Just sound them out and you'll get them. You've heard both. I'll see you next time.